This is Joel Kotkin.
And this is Marshall Toplansky.
And you're listening to the Feudal Future podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we are going to be talking about the future of cities. And joining us today are two experts in that area. Austin Williams is a professor of practice at Kingston University, has done a tremendous amount of work in China. He is currently doing this recording from London, which is where Kingston University is located, and he's a professor of architecture and landscape. Cullum Clark is director of the Bush Institute at SMU in Dallas, and he's the director of the Economic Growth Initiative there, and a professor of economics at SMU. Gentlemen, welcome.
Great to be with you, Marshall and Joel. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed.
Well, let's kick off the conversation by talking about future cities. And maybe the best place to start is to really understand if there is a model or a definition of what a future city actually is.
Austin.
Well, sorry, I was pausing there because I was trying to rack my brains whether there's any definition for a future city, but I don't think there is. I mean, since talking prior to this podcast, we were mentioning China. There's two future cities which are officially designated in China at the moment. One is Shenzhen, because they're building this new extended portion out beyond Hong Kong, which is designed in inverted commas by NBBJ, American practice, and Tencent, one of the major tech companies in China. So that's going on at the moment, which is like a huge linear rectangular box stuck out into the water, about 1/4 the size of Manhattan. And then in the north of China, just outside Beijing, to the south of Beijing, you have Xiong'an New Area, which was given its blessing by President Xi about 6 years ago, and now it's a vast area. It's still, a long way from completed, but it's taking massive shape. It's going to be, what can I say, the size of a small country. I think the reforestation area, where they're actually planting new trees, is going to be the size of the Maldives. If you ever worry about the Maldives, maybe you should less worry about them. But there's going to have this huge kind of environmental idea, and both of them are kind of based on technology, innovation, new tech, facial recognition, and surprisingly within the Chinese context, but a lot of those companies are really kind of at the fore. So I think that's how they're viewing the future city. It's kind of future technology of the future, and how maybe we can take advantage of it. Ironically, the Shenzhen model is going to be a no car city. That's their tick box of how it is a future city. In the future, we will not drive. We will walk and cycle everywhere. So, in some respects, it's positive, some slightly more negative, I would suggest.
Shall I take that one up too, Marshall?
Yeah, I'm just going to ask you, Cullum, what, here we're looking at this kind of technology-based future with a good deal of central planning. You are really quite familiar with the development of the urban form in the United States, and especially in Texas. I'm presuming that it's a lot more laissez-faire.
Absolutely. I would not bet in favor of central planners at all when it comes to the future of cities, any more than I would have bet on the utopian schemes of the past to predict the rise of successful cities. I would argue, Marshall, that the successful cities of the future will do what successful cities have always done, but subject to the technological constraints and opportunities of the time, right? So what have successful cities always done? Well, they have essentially exist because they help people and firms to be more innovative and productive, right? People coming together, ideas bouncing together. This is, in a sense, why cities exist in some basic economic sense. They also exist to provide a certain quality of life. People have come to them because they want to be there to have a better life. And they also, I think, as Joel has written about in a number of his books, they also help people to be part of something larger than themselves. They build community, right? This has always been the case, going back to ancient times, but it's always been subject to what the technology of the time will allow. And clearly, the technology of the time has progressively allowed cities to become physically more outwardly expansive, and just going back to the train and the automobile and so forth. But now we're in a new world where digital technology is allowing still greater spread. So I think what we will see is a lot of experimentation with how do you do those classic things, help people and businesses to be productive and innovative, give people the quality of life that they're looking for, build community, but in the context of a digitized, connected world. And I think that what's happening in a number of the big metropolitan areas in Texas, but to some degree elsewhere in the United States, it kind of shows the way. I'm less expert on what's happening in China, but I think what's really notable about what's happening in the US is there's not a single success story that can be chalked up to a brilliant master plan by central planners. In every case, it's just plain happened. And it happened basically because of market forces and human preferences just acting on space, right? People going where they want to go. Typically, in an increasingly knowledge-centric economy, it's been a case of skilled people choosing where they want to live on all kinds of grounds, some of them old, some of them quite new issues, and then businesses typically following. So I think that's the way it will continue to be.
I would like to just ask something to Austin, just because it just ran into my head, which is what Texas has done. You know, we have to remember, for the first time in American history, one state has two of the five largest metros. We've never seen that before. Dallas and Houston. Something is happening on a massive scale.
And
what about China? I mean, in China, you have, I assume that cities are planned by, well-educated mandarins who, are thinking in these big sense. So you really can't adjust the way the Dallas economy is doing it. And is there a danger in that?
Well, I mean, as I was listening to Cullum, and to reinforce your point, I think Cullum said that people go where they want to go. Obviously, that may be the case in Dallas, but certainly not the case in China. You kind of go where you're told. There's a great movie, if you get the chance to see it, like a documentary called The Land of Many Palaces, which is looking at the new city in Ordos, the Ordos new development. And it just looks at the creation of a new city. So I think this is the first time in human history. I mean, you may correct me if I'm mistaken, but the first time in human history where you do not organically develop a city from mercantile trade, or stopping off at a crossroads and developing hotels and bars and a village into a larger place. This is where you build a city. You build a city, and then you shoehorn people into it. And the Land of Many Palaces does that. It looks at all the farming areas around Ordos, where poor farmers are then told, you're living in in poverty, your trade is dying. If I were you, I'd move into the city, would give you a bright new apartment, and you have to acclimatize. And you can see the traumas and the difficulty that they had to go through to get there. So it's a much more, as you can imagine, much more single-minded activity within China. But that's the nature of China, because they don't have the luxury of kind of 300 years or 250 years of organic growth. That, say, Chicago starting, in the 1830s, wherever it was, with a couple of families, suddenly takes 75 years to get to 1 million people. China goes in Shenzhen, goes from 300,000 people, and 30 years later, it's 15 million, right? That doesn't happen organically. So, so they want to make it happen and then stabilize. So at the moment, they're kicking people out of Beijing, kicking people out of Shanghai, because it's reached their optimum level of population, and they don't want to have shanty developments. They're moving them out of the city. So it's a completely different framework. I think the Dallas, I mean, obviously, in terms of Dallas, there's an element within that Texas kind of cluster that there is a military intervention going on there. There is a military history to actually why maybe some of those places developed in the way that they did, and some of the technologies that have developed. So there is still a little bit of state interest in what's going on there, but not in the same way as China, I have to say.
Yeah, and I just like to add one point, and then turn it to Marshall. But you know, we do a lot of planning in America, but the planning is being done at the private level. So we just are releasing a report on the new cities, and Dallas is one place where there are a lot of them where they're master planned communities, but they're master planned by capitalists trying to reach a market. You know, Don Bren, who built Irvine, or was run Irvine and really made it into what it is today. You know, Don Bren wants to make money. You know, yes, he wants to build a beautiful community, and Marshall is a former Irvine resident himself, or inmate, if we want to say. But the bottom line is, in the U.S., we do it, but we're not saying no plan. We're just saying, but you want to plan for the market. And I think that may be the big difference, is in China, they're planning for different reasons.
But you know, there is a conscious underpinning of government support, whether you're in China or whether you're in Texas, to be able to make this development happen. Obviously, in China, you have a much greater ability to dictate exactly what's going to happen. And in the United States, you have more of an ability to lay the foundational groundwork that enables developers to be able to then work within it. What I wonder about for Dallas, Cullum, is whether or not all of the work that Texas is doing as a state to try to position itself as an attractive place for investment is something that is being coordinated very closely with city officials, or whether they just are seeming to be, you know, disconnected.
No, I would not say that Texas is particularly modeling close coordination between state government, private sector, and city officials. On the contrary, they're oftentimes at loggerheads. In our political system, of course, we have a very conservative Republican majority and Republican governor in charge of the state. In the core cities of our metropolitan areas, Dallas, as well as Austin, San Antonio, and Houston, we are, you know, very much have blue state mayors and city councils, if you will, or, you know, sort of deep blue ones. And then in suburban places, of which there are a great many that are booming around the big metropolitan areas of Texas, things are more purple typically, right? But no, there's not a lot of close coordination. In fact, the people who actually run the various levels of government typically wring their hands about how difficult it is to coordinate anything at the public sector level. And the private sector developers, who are the ones actually making most of this activity, this growth happen, you know, they typically find dealing with the public sector quite frustrating in quite a few of our cities, but nonetheless, they sort of manage to get it done anyhow. One thing that I think we've had in, that I think is a potential model for the future, we've had it in the big metropolitan areas in Texas, but I think we've had it in really around, in particular, some of the other high growth Sun Belt places like North Carolina, Tennessee, is a very high degree of decentralized competition among municipalities. So when we talk about role of government, of course, there's basic things governments, you know, all local governments need to undertake to do. You know, we've pretty well decided they're going to educate kids, for example. But you know, on top of that, in a system like ours, where there's, gosh, just in Collin County, north of Dallas, I think there's roughly 30 municipal jurisdictions. I may be understating it. Some of them are growing really, really fast. They all feel themselves to be in an acute competition with each other. And they're competing on, you know, amenities of all kinds. They're trying to compete on, you know, when they work with private sector developers to create a, you know, a master plan community, they're trying to compete on putting in the best, you know, parks and green space. They compete, you know, brutally on school quality, right? Every city every district, I should say, trying to say, you know, kind of they have the best one. So that competition, while frustrating for the people who are in the middle of competing, actually has really useful results. You know, this sort of a race to the top, as it were, that has been, I think, really, really good. Now, there are some in a competitive situation. A number of cities don't manage themselves very well, and they fall behind. We have that in Texas, and we see that all over America. There are plenty of suburban places that probably could be doing a lot better if they you know, tackle their educational challenges more effectively, or their you know, law and order challenges. There's all kinds of challenges that are going under addressed out there. but the ones who do it well win in this competitive environment.
You are. Thank you for bringing that up. You're leading us into an area that I really wanted to explore, which is for both of you. Is it possible that old cities can actually become future cities? You know, what I hear both of you saying is that the technology that is driving urban development for the future that everybody wants to tap into, whether it's, you know, Internet of Things or facial recognition or AI or whatever it happens to be, gives, if you're new and you're looking at life from kind of a greenfield perspective, you have a strategic advantage in being able to actually make some of this stuff happen. But what do you do if you're Baltimore? What do you do if you're London? You know, and you have all this legacy infrastructure that you have to deal with.
Or even, you know, Cullum lived in Japan for a while, Osaka. Even to some extent, couldn't you even say a city like Wuhan, which is an old industrial city? There, you know, I think this is a very relevant point, because we have all these places in Europe and in America and even in China and Japan that are antiquated and built on a different economy.
Well, can I speak to that, or unless you'd rather go first, Austin?
No, carry on. I'll follow.
You know, work we've done at the Bush Institute and SMU, I think really does argue pretty strongly, for better or for worse, that it really just plain is easier to create a city of the future, a prosperous, high opportunity place where people and businesses want to be, on what is in a sense a greenfield site, or at least maybe where there's some nucleus from which you can build, but you can build outwards quite easily. I do think it just fundamentally is easier, and I think that's pretty evident when you talk to the people managing, you know, big legacy cities and newer cities. Not that the ones running the new cities have an easy job, but they're very conscious of the fact that they can avoid a lot of, bypass a lot of legacy issues and sort of get things a little more right in ways that the mayors of the old cities wish they could kind of rerun the tape again. Now, that said, I don't think that we should, give up or believe that it can't be done, because legacy cities do obviously have some incredible strengths. They have some, neighborhoods of great character and history and amenities that are, like parks that are historic, arts facilities and so forth, that can be, it's very hard for a young kind of upstart city to match that even over several generations. Obviously, we see that with, booming areas of Austin City, of London. I think there are a handful of other really wonderful turnaround stories. Copenhagen, as I understand it, was a really struggling place in the 70s and 80s. And as arguably a pretty successful case of making a whole lot of lifestyle-oriented investments that people appreciate. It probably helped also to be the national capital and kind of the unequivocal center of business in a small country. Nonetheless, they seem to have done a number of things right. I actually think Tokyo, you mentioned that I lived in Japan, and I think Tokyo is also actually, interestingly enough, a case, again, benefiting from being the national capital, but also that's managed to renew itself around older strengths in ways that have been pretty effective. It's pretty visible when you go there versus going to like Osaka or Nagoya, for example, that, one place is doing a heck of a lot better at creating the kind of the urban landscape of the future than the others are. So clearly it can be done. It's clearly about massive, intelligent investment in quality of life in ways that respect what is already there, that builds on a sense of, authenticity and history that people have shown that they appreciate. So it clearly can be done. What's kind of, disturbing and a little bit sad is that so many places that really could do that just really aren't succeeding at it. I mean, I don't know that much about Baltimore, but, places that obviously have, a historic harbor with a, long and interesting waterfront.
It's a beautiful city, actually.
It's a beautiful, beautiful city. And then it just becomes an issue of, well, are you going to make it a place where people want to be? There's all kinds of choices cities can make where they won't make it a place where people want to be, then they won't succeed.
Yeah, well, if I can just jump in? I mean,
sure.
Well, there's an awful lot on the table, so I might either flit around or lose track of what's being said, but excuse me. I mean, there's there's that idea about building an urban or a city identity, and then there's an idea of building a national identity via your city, isn't there? And I think maybe some of the Asian cities are very adept at kind of reinforcing a sense of the national, the sense that you're developing a city and you're part of the broader nation, which may or may not be part of the rise of the Asian economies and the decline of the Western economies. The sense that people in the West are much more risk averse and see the future as a negative or a problematic place to be, whereas the Asian seem to see as their future and are quite happy to anticipate it. I mean, I think in the same way that creative destruction is kind of quite a useful thing under capitalism, where those companies that don't perform go to the wall, and that new industries kind of come in their place. Whether that's the same process which occurs within the urban environment, I don't really know whether it can take that same form. I understand that there are many dead and dying and sometimes useless, and maybe people are willing to vacate certain towns and cities, like that has been going on in the north of America for a long time. But whether that can be halted, and if it is halted, whether that's done organically or whether that's done by some kind of investment and state push to maintain people in those regions, I'm not too sure. But I was only going to come back, if you don't mind, if I come back on a previous point about the whole idea about capitalism organic development of the economy versus state-centered. If you see what's going on in China at the moment, there's two big clusters. Well, there's more than two, but formative ones are the ones at Shanghai, Kunshan, Hangzhou. Hangzhou is where Alibaba is based, with Jack Ma, and Shenzhen and that whole Guangzhou area is where Pony Ma and Tencent is based. No relations, obviously. But Jack Ma, if you remember, just a year ago disappeared. There he was, the biggest stock market flotation in the world. Within 3 months, because he was basically saying that the Communist Party of China, gets in the way of really creative, innovative capitalist investment. They really don't know what they're doing and they should move aside. Within about a week, he disappeared off the scene and was locked away for 6 months, being re-educated in the ways of diplomacy. Similarly, I mean, Pony Ma, who keeps well away from the media, from Tencent, he's just had $15 billion wiped off his share capital because they're involved in gaming. And China is going through this big thing at the moment about trying to wean young people off gaming and to get them back to be socialized and maybe kind of play a better role in society rather than stay in their bedrooms. A similar conversation that we hear in the West, but in China, they make it happen. In the West, we complain about it. But you know what I mean? So there's this kind of idea that once a capitalist or an entrepreneur gets too big for their boots and is trying to do something kind of quite innovative, suddenly that is a threat. The innovation itself is a demonstration of autonomy. A demonstration of autonomy is a separation from the party. Therefore, these things can't be allowed to happen. So you allow a little bit of that flourishing to occur, and then you have to rein it back in again. So China is in a little bit of a bind when it comes to how you can actually allow organic development to occur, whether that's urban or business. And it's something which it's a contradiction that they can't overcome.
But, regardless of what the priorities are, for planners, whether they're private industry planners or whether they're public industry planners, one of the big overriding strategic themes around development is climate change and protection of the environment. One of the things that Joel and I have been studying here in California, for instance, is the subtle influence of climate change on regulation of all kinds, so that the idea of adapting to the future has actually got a whole lot of restrictions associated with it because of the stated desire to protect the environment. Are you seeing this as a theme playing out across both the country and the world? We'll start with you, Austin.
Without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, it's becoming, again, Joel mentioned before we started that he was doing an article on nudge. People are so confident about nudging people in the right direction now that they don't actually do it in secret anymore. They're very explicit about nudging people. So those environmental conversations are very upfront. In many ways, the way I see it playing out, I mean, in the West, it's kind of very clear. There's a clampdown on driving. There's a clampdown on certain energy use, and certain businesses are now being promoted and subsidized, and others being thrown to the dogs. But what they've managed to do, which is quite remarkable, really, that through this kind of moral campaign about saving the planet, whatever that might mean, they've actually have managed to bring China into line. So that idea that China was a runaway success and running rampant and becoming slightly more dominant even than America in global trade, suddenly they're back in their box again, and they're having to cut back on heavy industry. They're having to cut back on their production forces. Even Guangzhou is losing workers rather than gaining workers. So it's a phenomenally. I mean, you kind of think it's such a floaty, lovely, cuddly subject, helping nature and everything, and then you realize the viciousness and the power behind it, to be able to put China, move it away from its kind of dynamism is quite remarkable.
China's environmental awakening is America's supply chain problem.
Well, I mean, in some respects, I think America is, well, I know that Russia is stepping in to supplement some of China's refusal to take Australian coal, but I think America has also managed to sell some to China. Global trade is a wonderfully mysterious thing. Do you know what I mean? And hypocrisy rules. But I do reckon that given the fact that China is kind of building these new cities, but is then ticking the right box. I mean, the book I wrote on eco-cities was predominantly to show that it's all bullshit, if you excuse my language. But they just recognize that if you're going to sell yourself on a world market and encourage people to come and invest, it's one of those things you have to tick a box with. So if you can call, Shanghai is now an eco-city predominantly because they refuse to develop on Chongming Island, which is 1/3 of the landmass of Shanghai. So therefore, they have a 1/3 woodland, tick the box of nature reserve. So by not developing, you can now be seen to be a kind of an eco god. So it's all game playing, but China's learning very fast. But at the moment, they still are the pupil being taught by the West rather than the other way around.
Well, Cullum, before you answer, I mean, the question I would have is, if the present ruling party, that probably assumes more cohesiveness than it actually exists, but the current ruling party is very much Northeast, traditional urbanist thinking, lots of money for transit, lots of talk about trying to stop suburban sprawl. How does a city like Dallas, which has really benefited tremendously by its land use, is there any concern that the federal government is going to try to wrap their knuckles and make them sort of become more like Manhattan?
Gosh, I hope not, Joel. I think that there are a number of trends, not to be Pollyanna-ish, because I'll maybe say a couple things that are less so, but there are a number of trends that, among other things, that big metro areas like Dallas and Houston and so forth demonstrate that are ultimately good if allowed to take their course. So, for example, as we've seen this big outward expansion of the metropolitan area, this enormous growth on particularly the northern edge of the metropolitan area here, and primarily a movement to the kind of the westward direction in the Houston area. I think there's a lot of hand-wringing, like, oh, that must be terrible for the environment because it means that people will be making like really, really long commutes and burning a whole lot of gasoline. Well, there's a couple problems with that. One is that the jobs are moving in the direction of growth even faster than the people are, which means actually that people, as time goes by, are actually commuting shorter distances, not longer, in these big metropolitan areas. If we kind of allow things to take their natural course and don't overregulate land use to some degree, and I'm not saying perfectly, but to some degree, markets will actually bring workplaces and residential places close enough together that we kind of hold down the total amount of commuting, which would be generally good news on the green front. And then, of course, we also have a pretty powerful trend towards changing vehicle technology. And that too is going to make a pretty big difference. I think that there's a couple things that do kind of, stress me a little bit about this. One, again, kind of the top-down central planning versus, let's say a more decentralized approach. I think that there is a place for federal regulation, but clearly we're at risk of kind of not so much imposing clear, understandable rules that everyone understands, but trying some kind of giant exercise in the federal government picking winners and subsidizing this or that company, like another Solyndra or whatever. I can't imagine that's going to be a useful way to go. And then remember, Joel, I'm an economist, and as economists, we like 99% of us agree on a couple of basic principles around climate change. One is that good climate policy would be putting a national price on carbon, just a very simple, understandable tax, and then letting the market kind of play itself out around that. And yet we see no tendency towards that at all. Another basic, simple point is that if the trends are as the experts say, the federal government, as well as every state and local government, should be engaged in a certain amount of adaptation policy, right? They should be, thinking a little bit about how do you build the better, levees if you're close to the water, or how do you, in some form or another, if you're in California and you're near a whole lot of very dense forest that potentially could burn your city down, how do you maybe thin the forest in a little bit in a sensible way? Good forestry techniques, which apparently are not allowed in your state, Joel.
Lunacy needs a home too.
Right.
So, but somehow we've gotten into this mode where even the most sensible adaptation policies are considered either not acceptable for some kind of reason, or even considered to be a bad thing, because if we actually sensibly lowered the risk to California cities or coastal cities in Florida or whatever, that would somehow lessen the urgency around doing what activists most want to do, and I don't think that's a very useful path.
Well, that's really interesting. You talk about adaptation, because as we move toward the close of our episode today, I wanted to talk to you about how urbanization is adapting to pandemics. The knee-jerk reaction, at least in the United States, and I presume in Europe as well, when COVID hit, was in essence de-densification, right? People, obviously the buildings are still there, but the people left. And they moved to places that were much less dense. I just wonder what your feeling is about the long-term potential of urbanization to slow, because let's face it, we're probably going to be living with a bunch of pandemics for the long-term future. Nobody's thinking that COVID is going to be completely conquered. So I'd love your opinion on that. Are we seeing kind of a structural impediment to future densification here?
Okay, I'll chip in. I think yes and no. It depends how it all pans out.
Oh, that's definitive.
I know, and I'm not the economist. No, I think that well, it's one of those things. I mean, it depends on the response and the continuation of this risk-averse paranoia, as I might frame it, if you don't mind. That every time that a variant crops up, we lock down, or we shut people out, or we tell people to stay home, or whatever it might be. I mean, we have in London. It's taken maybe, because we opened up quite early on. Well, I mean, late on, but quite earlier than the rest of Europe has done, for maybe the last 4 months or so. And it's taken that amount of time to recognize that there's a certain confidence coming back to people on the streets and traveling around. Probably about 20% of people on the underground wear masks, that there's a certain sense, you can now go to a pub and it's absolutely packed. It's a really, really enjoyable, certain, gone back to normal in some respects. But that's been absolutely shattered in the last couple of days when, suddenly the new variants come up and suddenly we're told we have to wear masks, we have to possibly work from home. And there's an automatic response to that, which is that I'm not going to take the risk myself. And, even though they haven't told me to work from home, I will work from home. And that's now led to maybe offices are open maybe 2 days out of 5, or you kind of job share, things like that, which then means that all those industries which go alongside it are losing, 3/5 of their business. And so the knock-on effect is economic. as well as kind of social. But it's also, I think, philosophical. Or that's probably too grand a word for it. But there's a certain sense that people now are seeing other people as a problem or a risk or a threat. And that's no way to develop an urban mindset. The whole idea about metropolitanism is we all get along and rub along together. And in some ways, we don't ask questions about each other. So I think that that frame of mind, if that becomes really embedded, is going to be devastating for the concept of the city, not necessarily the physical form. And I think those things maybe go hand in hand. So, I mean, I don't really know how it's going to pan out, but it's not looking great, I have to say.
Cullum?
Can I do that one too, Marshall? I would say very, very similar answer, yes and no. I would argue that broadly defined, the forces supporting urbanism as a way of organizing human life are far too powerful for any pandemic we've seen to stop or to overturn, in my judgment. Urbanism, cities of various, we've been continually redefining what even is a city over the course of history, and we're continuing to do so in ways we've talked about the last few minutes. But they are going to remain the best way of organizing human effort to be productive and do useful things for each other, and the best way to organize, not all, but a great many activities that people just like to engage in as part of a good life. I don't see that going away. On the contrary, I think history teaches that again and again we adapt. We figured out how to clean up the water supply and not have, waterborne pathogens be a source of, of death and disease and so forth at times in the past. And we'll keep on figuring this out. I think we have learned some, so that's maybe a little bit glib, but I think it's pretty likely true. Now, that said, we have seen a distaste for very high density. That has clearly driven something of a de-densification. I would argue that the pandemic was kind of a nice, not nice, but very tragic, but a kind of a shove in a direction that we were kind of gearing up to go anyway. That very high density is something that maybe like young people in a dance club like when they go out at night or something very briefly, but most people don't actually really want to live or work that way most of the time. Essentially, it was a mid-20th century white collar office technology that we've learned how to improve on. So I wouldn't be very bullish about the very dense cores of big cities. Wait, can I say one other thing, Austin? And then, but I also think another thing we've learned is we've learned something from the certain of the public policy reactions to the pandemic. Like, for example, some cities have gotten themselves into serious hot water by taking, one might say, overly draconian approaches to closing schools. And the political reaction among in communities is very, very strong right now. So, I think that we have learned that there's a whole lot of ways you can mismanage things in the context of a pandemic that will really, undermine the whole basis of why people want to live in your city, and will get them in a hurry looking elsewhere. So I think that's part of the picture as well. Austin, I'm sorry.
No, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Cullum. I was only going to add after you'd finished. I mean, and I think you were getting there, that idea about the divisive city, which in some ways is a contradiction in terms as to what a city should be. There is a certain sense that it's very hard to determine where the divide lies, because there are many, as Joel was saying earlier, there are many people within the working class who seem to have accepted restraints on their movement, as well as kind of some of the more elite class or the professional class or what have you. But there's definitely this sense, that I work in architecture, and so architects who have been working from home can only work from home on the basis that ordinary working people are putting one brick on top of another on a construction site. So you rely on some people. You can work from home provided somebody brings you a pizza on the back of a bicycle. So there's a class conversation going on here as well, which is slightly misleading. And part of that has led to this kind of almost a Victorian, again, I hate to use the English example, but the Victorian model of unclean people and clean people. There's a miasma out there of people who are dirty and shouldn't be touched and have to be kept at 2-meter distance or 1.5 yards, wherever it is in America. And then there's us who are legitimate to go about our business. So we have at the moment, again, I don't know when this podcast is going out, but we've just had this kind of conversation in the media about Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, who's happily going to a Christmas party with his lovely upper class business friends. Meanwhile, at the same time last Christmas, when he had that party, all of us were never allowed to even meet our families. We couldn't meet one person in our family. Yet, the establishment can do it, but we can't. So there's an open hypocrisy. Or it's not even called hypocrisy, it's just the way it is. One rule for them, one rule for us. And that's the way that cities may find themselves cutting in future, which I think is a very, very dangerous scenario.
And as you would imagine, our podcast is on feudalism. So these class issues, and I think I'm really appreciative that you bring that up, because I think when I talk to various people, my older daughter works at Home Depot, and I'll tell you, that's where I hear the real deal about people being sick, people not wanting to vaccinate, people that can't get people to come to work, all sorts of things. So I think one of the big issues we're going to have to deal with, those of us who write about cities, is also to be aware of what Austin's talking about, that there are all these people, they don't have, they can't do what we're doing right now. We can't come from home and talk about things. They have to be the city, and we have to figure out, I think, for the city to survive as a unit and under some form of civil order, we're going to have to figure out those people who are putting those bricks down. How do we address them? How do we make them engaged in things? And then obviously, how do we keep them safe? So anyway,
on that wonderful dystopic note.
What do you mean? I was being hopeful. I was trying to do a mitzvah.
I want to thank Cullum Clark and Austin Williams for joining us on the Feudal Future podcast. Gentlemen, this has been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for being part of our podcast.
Thanks for having us, Marshall and Joel. Good to see you.
Nice to see you.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks, Marshall.
Take care.